Well, so good afternoon again. Day 3 and topic 3. I'll try and make some connections maybe at the end to the earlier lectures, but this is a standalone lecture again, which may be just as well because I can see at least some faces in the audience of people who weren't here at the first of my talks. I've called it Beauty's Child, and I should explain the story behind today's lecture. What I'm going to do is to present an illustrated version of something I've written for a book, which is called The Consequences of Poetry. And it's going to be published next year, at least I hope it will be. And the idea was that 15 authors who didn't know each other, or didn't know who the other ones were, each would be sent a poem and asked to write an essay, which itself ended with another piece of poetry which the author chose. And that piece of poetry was sent to the next author on the list. And then that author wrote an essay and so on. So it's a kind of consequences game. And I've yet to see what's going to come out of this volume. It's a very different set of people and with very different attitudes towards scholarship and the world, I think. So we'll look forward to seeing what comes. But so far, all I know is that this is the poem which I was sent, which rather took me aback. Stars are poor books, and oftentimes do miss. This book of stars lights to eternal bliss. Well, I confess that I'm not sufficient of a metaphysical poet, scholar, to actually understand that when I first saw it. What it means, I gather, is that stars are not the best way of predicting the future, and they often get it wrong. This book of stars, and George Herbert means the Bible, lights to eternal bliss. So trust the Bible rather than trust the stars. I had a bit of a problem to think where to go with this, and you're going to hear what I did with it. I decided to write an essay called Beauty's Child, Sexual Selection, Nature Worship, and the Love of God. So since I have a text here, I'm going to move between the slides and my text fairly formally. So when I stand in front of a famous work of art, let's say Michelangelo's painting of the creation on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, I sometimes have a wonderful feeling of connection. I don't mean so much connection to the artist, though there is that as well, but connection to the other people who've stood here before me. Here is where they all have stood, and this is what they all have looked at. Einstein, Queen Victoria, John Lennon, Nelson Mandela, Picasso, my great-grandpa, and probably many of you in this audience today. We've all been enticed to this one spot by this one work of art. Now, when you and I are present in a room, we can look into each other's mental states. We can lock into each other's mental states by jointly attending to the same object. And now here I am in the Sistine Chapel, doing that with all the other people who've been here before me, whom I've never met, been here and seen this. The work of art is acting as a connecting node. On some level, it's solving what games theorists call the coordination problem, how to get people who may be complete strangers into synchrony. But what if I should want more than that? What if I should want to connect to everyone who has ever lived? Now, Shakespeare never stood here in the Sistine Chapel. Alexander didn't. Socrates didn't. Genghis Khan wasn't there. Lucy, our Australopithecine ancestor, was never in the Sistine Chapel. And in truth, perhaps just 100 million people have seen this painting since it was created. Yet now, let's imagine there was to be a gallery visible everywhere on Earth whose works have been in place for millions of years. We don't have to imagine it. We can visit such a gallery every night. Look at the stars. Look up at the skies, or look at all those far folk sitting in the air. The poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, calls us out to celebrate God's heaven, but he's no need to. Every one of us has stared wonderingly at those patterns pricked into the blackness of space. Perhaps not everyone has perceived the exact same constellations that you and I do, but some of the groupings of stars and the stories told around them are certainly very old. The 7 stars which we Europeans see as making up the plough, at least in England we call it the plough, in America the Big Dipper, those in the constellation of the Great Bear, which is the larger grouping of stars, they've been associated with the bear in mythology of native peoples right across Europe and the Middle East, through Siberia and down through North America. There's every reason to think that the Paleolithic hunters and gatherers must have taken the legend of the Great Bear with them when they crossed the Bering Straits into North America 16,000 years ago. If I can get this, because we find this bear cult and the constellation of the Great Bear is being celebrated and recognized right the way down there. And indeed, caves in the Dordogne in France show evidence of bear cults going back as much as 30,000 years. Now, if it is in fact somewhere in the Dordogne that the legend of those stars originated, it means that we today are seeing a pattern that has been recognized as a picture in the sky by 1,000 generations of human beings. Well, I love that idea, but many questions follow from it. Did our ancestors consider the stars a work of art? And if so, whose work? Did they find them beautiful? What would beauty have meant to them? Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? But every night come out those envoys of beauty and light the universe with their admonishing smiles." Stars are poor books, George Herbert says, compared to God's Bible. But are stars, to the contrary, the book in which our ancestors first saw the hand of God? Well, with those questions, I want to engage you in a discussion of the deep history of beauty. And by deep, I mean the seen from an evolutionary perspective. I am, as I've had occasion to explain before, I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I believe that to understand and fully appreciate human mental traits, we need to know why they are there, which is to say what biological functions they serve. Evolutionary psychologists have been making pretty good progress, but as we say, there are some elephants in the living room, big issues that no one wants to talk about, and human beings' worship of the beautiful seems to me to be one of the biggest. Evolutionary theory has no problem in explaining many, perhaps even most, of the things that give people pleasure. Honey, orgasms, babies' smiles, sunshine, lullabies, fresh water, flower gardens. That's all easy to explain, but the closer we get to high art and to beauty proper, the less easy it becomes to explain how people's attraction to it can be contributing to biological survival. Now, if beauty were of relatively minor significance in human lives, we evolutionary theorists could push it aside. But in reality, it's the opposite. While people like the lesser pleasures, they don't love them passionately or attempt to justify their lives by them. But with beauty, they do. John Hadfield, the critic, can say, for example, "What is it that makes life so abundantly, so triumphantly worth living?" If I had to answer the question in one word, the word would be beauty. Or G.E. Moore, the philosopher, "Personal affection and the appreciation of what is beautiful in art or nature are good in themselves. It's only for the sake of these things, in order that as much as possible of them may at some time exist, that anyone can be justified in performing any public or private duty. Personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest and by far the greatest goods we can imagine." Well, we may not agree entirely, of course, but we can surely see where these enthusiasts are coming from. The proposition that it's beauty that gives life a purpose makes human sense, as it wouldn't do if we were to replace beauty, for example, with, let's say, food. What is it that makes life so abundantly and so triumphantly worth living? If I had to give the answer in one word, the word would be food. Well, maybe, but I think in the end we'd all say, no, that won't do. But you may think I'm not playing fair now. Is beauty, I'm using it, as you can hear me using it with a capital B, is beauty really, truly such a unique and special category? Isn't beauty perhaps just the limiting case of the ordinary pleasures, produced perhaps by the coming together of several separate dimensions of pleasure at one time? Well, Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, in his book, How the Mind Works, has suggested something very like that. In the case of music, for example, he writes, "I suspect that music is auditory cheesecake, an exquisite confection crafted to tickle the sensitive spots of at least 6 of our mental faculties." Well, I'm sure we can agree with Pinker that music does indeed excite our appetites in just the ways that he lists. And no doubt a similar story could be told about visual cheesecake. We could tell that about painting. But surely it can't be the whole story. For this low-level explanation of why we find music so appealing makes no bridge at all to beauty. It's true, some music hardly counts as beautiful. And music, indeed, can be merely pretty or pleasant. And some of this may well come under Pinker's recipe. But it's true, too, that we're not always in the mood to respond to the beauty of music, even when it is potentially there. But when the music is beautiful and we are in the mood, then we know the difference between music in the concert hall and muzak in the shopping mall. Our emotional response to the former is different in degree and kind. John Hadfield produced 3 celebrated anthologies. One he called, as I said, A Book of Beauty, another A Book of Pleasures, and the third A Book of Delights. Now, if I could open them up in front of you, you'd soon see why these 3 books are not the same. Let me list several of the reasons, I think reasons that would surely occur to you, why the response to beauty is indeed quite special and distinct from the response to cheesecake, for example. We think of beauty, as Moore said, as good in itself. We don't think of cheesecake as good in itself. We're prepared to say with Keats, the poet, that beauty is truth, truth beauty. We feel virtuous and not merely greedy in pursuing our love of beauty, and expect others to appreciate us for being so taken up with beauty, as if rather than indulging a private appetite, we're honoring something wonderful outside ourselves. We love beauty through the medium of our senses, of course, but at the same time, what we love is obviously not merely the sensory stimulus as such. With cheesecake, we have only to have the stimulus on our tongue and the right effective buttons will be pressed. But with beauty, it's not so straightforward. For a start, we often need to be told that this is beauty before we'll respond to it at all. Henry Thoreau said, "We don't enjoy poetry unless we know it to be poetry." And the same isn't true, indeed, of many kinds of art, many works of art. We find beauty in a framed picture in a gallery where we might miss it entirely if we were to come across the same pattern of colours unframed outside in the world. As Robert Browning wrote, "We're made so that we love first when we see them painted, things we have passed perhaps 100 times, nor cared to see." Now, it's true that the same is sometimes true of other pleasures, including food and drink. It's probably true that we don't enjoy the taste of an oyster unless we know it to be an oyster. And certainly it's true that we don't enjoy a great wine, at least not so much, unless we know that it's a great and expensive wine. A recent experiment showed that people don't even know the difference between dog food and pâté de foie gras in a blind test. Undertaken by the Wine Society, as it happens. But I think what this shows is that some foods and maybe some wines can indeed be considered works of art. Pâté de foie gras may be, but cheesecake, I don't think so. Even so, with beauty in art, it isn't enough that an object with the right sensory qualities should actually exist and have come to our attention as art. We still need to know who made it and how. We care deeply about creative input, genuineness, and authenticity. We would find a copy of a slice of cheesecake just as tasty as any other version. But we find a reproduction of a Rembrandt painting, for example, less valuable and certainly less beautiful, surely, than the original. While we enjoy the cheesecake for its gustatory qualities without thinking to ask who made it, it could have been made by a cheesecake robot. We value the work of art only when we see the human hand behind it. For example, we marvel at the prehistoric cave paintings at Lascaux only because we believe they were made by artists. If it were to turn out that these images were simply water stains, then they'd merely become quaint. This old man's face may amuse us, but we won't praise the artistry behind it. Now, alongside this concern with authenticity comes our concern with being taken in by fraud. We want to be sure that the author of the work of art which is impressing us is indeed worthy of our respect. Looking at a Kandinsky painting, for example, or hearing Schoenberg's music for the first time, we worry perhaps that a child could have done it, or even an animal, or even a computer. We don't have that kind of worry about cheesecake. And as some of you may have recognized, this isn't a Kandinsky. It was actually painted by a chimpanzee, and maybe you begin to look at it a bit differently. When it comes to music, Douglas Hofstadter says it would be a tragedy if it should turn out that a computer program could emulate the artistic genius of Bach or Mozart. Well, it's tough on Doug Hofstadter. That's a computer invention, helped along by David Cope, I should say. And so, as he says, he's been sucked in by a vast illusion, or he may begin to think he has been. And that would be, for me, an absolute tragedy, because my entire life I've been moved by music, and somehow he thinks it wouldn't be appropriate to be moved by the composition of a computer. We are indeed moved, emotionally moved by beauty. Beauty stirs us up and takes us over, giving rise on occasion to the peculiar feeling of flow or of union. The novelist Rebecca West, for example, she writes of this crystalline concentration of glory, this deep and serene and intense emotion that I feel before the greatest works of art. What in the world is this emotion? What's the bearing of supremely great works of art on my life, which makes me feel so glad? Well, what does it look like to an evolutionary psychologist? To answer her, I'd say what we're seeing in these and other peculiarities of human beings' response to beauty are the telltale signs of a social emotion. Beauty arouses passion, moral passion, and the moral passions, jealousy, rage, infatuation, grief, devotion, admiration, humility, those are in origin always concerned with other people. And so too, I've no doubt, with beauty. We may seem to love beautiful things as if it were indeed the thing of beauty in itself that counts for us. But our feeling about the thing is always a proxy for our feeling about some idealized person in the background. So that the feelings aroused by beauty typically mirror the feelings we might otherwise have for a child, or a mother, or a friend, or a sexual partner. G.E. Moore, as we saw, lumped together aesthetic enjoyments with personal affection as the greatest goods we can imagine. But this apparently arbitrary combination, I think, begins to make real sense when we realize that the two classes of enjoyment belong, indeed, in the same category. Now, I just said it's like the feelings we have about a child, or a mother, or a friend, or a sexual partner. But of course, it would have to be sexuality that holds the key. And the evidence stares us in the face. The imagery of aesthetic ecstasy is time and again transparently erotic. We saw it already in Rebecca West's talk of this crystalline concentration of glory. But here again is a commentary by the French critic Jacques Bazin. The experience of great art disturbs one like a deep anxiety for another, like a near escape from death, a feeling of being penetrated and pervaded and mastered by some irresistible force. The philosopher George Santayana, he said, the whole sentimental side of our aesthetic sensibility, without which it would be perceptive and mathematical rather than aesthetic, is due to our sexual organization, remotely stirred. And I'm sure he was right. But he had no good idea why he was right, and nor for that matter did Sigmund Freud. Charles Darwin, however, had a pretty good idea. You see the subtitle of his great book, The Descent of Man, and selection in relation to sex. His idea was that human aesthetic preferences, in fact, evolved in the context of courtship and mate choice. Now, the argument, it's been particularly well developed by Geoffrey Miller in recent years. It can be summarized really in a few lines. It's this: when we're excited by beauty, whether in painting or music or sculpture or words or ideas, what's happening at a deeper level is that we're responding to features in the beautiful object that reveal or could reveal the hand of a human artist. In the real world, any such artist is likely to be an individual with especially well-developed manual and sensory and intellectual and maybe even moral skills. And a person with such skills is likely to be a person with highly desirable traits as a progenitor or a parent or a companion. And so when we're turned on by beauty and the things around us, we're being turned on by cues from the environment that we are in the presence of a potentially good mate or friend. Now, this one idea that aesthetic preferences arise through sexual selection provides a ready solution to so much that is otherwise puzzling about people's response to art. The nature of the emotion, the idolization of artistry, the demographics of who makes art and who responds, the anxiety on both the part of both artists and consumers about the art being true, and so on. And what's more, it goes a long way to providing an explanation for the specific content of art. If it's true that works of art are being, or at any rate in the evolutionary past were being, created primarily as a way for the artist to demonstrate his or her desirability as a partner, we should expect to find a clear relation between what people appreciate as artistry and the mental and intellectual traits they do in fact value in a partner. And we don't have to look far to find this prediction borne out in detail, for it's obvious as soon as we look for it how works of art are indeed showcases for those traits that most count for people in choosing a partner: dexterity, sensitivity, memory, creativity, humor, loyalty, good judgment, rich resources. When asked by Pope Boniface VIII to prove his skill as an artist, Giotto drew a perfect circle, freehand. Now, Archimedes in Raphael's painting isn't drawing in freehand, isn't drawing the circle freehand, but look at the expressions of rapture on the faces of his audience. If anything says artistry is sexy, I think this does. And arguably, there's a direct line from this to this. The musician Brian Eno has asked, himself a pop art piano player, he says, art seems to be something that we are biologically inclined to do. If we are, then what is the nature of that drive? What is it doing for us? Well, Darwin's answer, I think, is still the best we have, that artistry is indeed sexy. It's a way of showing off what you are worth. Now, still, even if this is a plausible answer to why people make art and appreciate it, it hardly can be the complete answer to the question of why people love beauty. For as it stands, this is a theory only of the human response to man-made beauty. And it hardly says, it says nothing at all at the moment about the response to the beauty of the natural world, in mountains or lakes or forests or plants or animals. There's nothing man-made here. There's nothing to have sex with. And yet the aesthetic emotions aroused by the beauties of nature and the beauties of art, though they're not the same, are certainly very much alike. I'm sure when our friends in the neuroscience department get round to doing fMRIs, they're going to find that the same parts of the brain light up in nature as when looking at paintings. Compare, for example, the celebrations of man-made beauty I've already quoted with Richard Jefferies' paean to the beauty of the earth. The hours when the mind is absorbed by the exceeding beauty of the earth are the only hours when we really live, so that the longer we can stay among these things, so much the more is snatched from inevitable time. Or again, compare the ardent sexuality, compare West's ecstatic response to human artistry with the reveries of William Wordsworth in a Welsh valley. For nature, then, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion, the tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood. Their colours and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love. Or, again, compare Bazan's swooning response to man-made art with Albert Camus' description of his mystic union with the landscape at Tipasa, which I quoted in my talk on Monday, but I'll give you a bit more of it to show you the sexual side of it. How many hours I've spent crushing absinthe leaves, caressing ruins, trying to match my breathing with the world's tumultuous size. Deep among wild scents and concerts of somnolent insects, I open my eyes and heart to the unbearable grandeur of this heat-soaked sky. I must be naked and dive into the sea, still scented with the perfumes of the earth, wash them off and consummate with my flesh the embrace for which sun and sea, lips to lips, have so long been sighing. It all is almost as if Camus is making love to the earth. Well, let's at least, I'll come back to that, let's at least start with something a bit simpler than that. It's not hard to see why people have evolved to look for beauty, the people who have evolved to look for beauty in a sexual partner should be turned on by some kinds of beauty in the natural world. And the reason is that many other creatures besides humans have evolved under sexual selection and have faced similar challenges to show off their fitness with brilliant displays of their resources, their health, their strength and skill, and so on. Displays that, like our own, are difficult to fake. So it means that the courtship displays of animals will boast many of the same features that we look for in displays by human artists. It's not surprising then that if some of the tricks the birds and bees use to impress their mates impress us too. The particular devices, let's say, with which a peacock tries to inspire love in a peahen, the symmetrical patterning, colourfulness, glossiness of his tail, for instance, will very likely inspire similar feelings of admiration in a human observer. If this tail were in fact man-made, it would certainly say something good about its human maker. And the same goes for the wings of a butterfly, or the majestic antlers of a stag, or the dance of the grebe, or the flashy colours of the coral reef, or for that matter, the song of a nightingale. Now, we humans find these he doesn't want to stop, you see. Sorry? I'll go on there, I'll see where I'm coming to. We find these animal displays attractive because they speak to us, I think, in the universal language of the biological courtier and troubadour. However, this can hardly be the whole story about what we find beautiful in nature, and the next slide shows you partly why. For it's patently not true that everything we find beautiful in nature has been made for display. To the contrary, much of it must surely be counted in some sense accidental. The patterns and colours of a seashell, for example, were certainly not made for anyone to look at, not for, certainly no other snail to look at, because they don't even have the eyes to do it, or the patterns of a willow tree, for example, or a sunset. They weren't made for any of us, or for us or for anyone else to look at, and yet they do still work a remarkable spell on us. So what can be going on? I think the answer lies, at least to begin with, in the remarkable convergence between the features of works of art that we value because they provide evidence of human skill, and features of natural things that have evolved and persisted because these features have given them staying power and survivability. That's to say, there's a convergence between our sense of aesthetically good form and nature's selection of evolutionary, stable form. In the case of animals and plants, part of the reason for this is, of course, the working of ordinary natural selection. To have a body that grows in an ordered and harmonious way just is the best way of building a living machine. So that even without the added stimulus of sexual selection, good form will have proved to be biologically adaptive. symmetry and segmentation and rhyme and balance and grace. These beautiful to us features will be the preferred choice of the blind watchstick maker, natural selection. But there's another reason for the convergence in our taste and in what goes out we find in nature, and that's the existence of universal, deep laws of morphogenesis, common to the development of all complex systems, laws that result in the emergence of attractor states, states that draw order from chaos. And these laws work across the whole of nature, wherever complex systems are in flux, so that we do in fact find order and harmony emerging not only in organic nature, but all around us in inorganic nature too, in the shapes of mountain ranges, or stone causeways, or clouds, or snow crystals, or galaxies. And indeed, similar processes can even result in the emergence of good form in populations of abstract entities, so that against the odds we even find beauty in things, or perhaps we should call them non-things, such as the natural numbers, as for example in the behavior of a cyclic number like this, the number 142857. I'm sure some of you know this magical number. You add it to yourself again and again and see what happens. It seems to twirl like the honeysuckle up the tree till it falls over. Add itself once and you'll see the numbers have remained in the same sequence. Add it again and again and again. You can check this later if you want to. And again. And then suddenly when you think this is all too much, you add it once more and suddenly the amazing contrast. Now suppose that we humans have indeed evolved to find all evidence of artistry beautiful, provided we can imagine the hand of an artist behind it. Then it's only to be expected that we will be taken in by these naturally occurring examples and find them beautiful too. Does anyone feel the same kind of emotion? Clive Bell asked, does anyone feel the same kind of emotion for a butterfly or a flower that he feels for a cathedral or a picture? Well, the answer, though it wasn't his, is that yes, we do feel similar emotion if and when we see the butterfly as a picture or the plants as a cathedral, when in short we see the natural forms as works of art. Now, I admit that might seem still to be a major difficulty for this account. The illusion of natural beauty works, I'm suggesting, provided we can imagine the hand of an artist behind it. But this proviso clearly raises problems. As I've stressed already, we are in fact highly sensitive to questions of authenticity in art. In general, if a work of art turns out not to be the work of the artist we imagined, but the work of an imposter or a mindless computer program, or even nothing at all, we changed to regarding it as relatively worthless. And so, surely there's a real question about why we should continue to value nature's works when in reality we know there's no artist who made them. Well, the answer, I think, is we don't know that. Or at any rate, we're very willing to deceive ourselves. And this deception has several factors helping to sustain it. To begin with, at least in modern culture, it happens that many of our encounters with nature, in fact, come first through art. We see pictures of flowers and animals and landscapes before we ever encounter the real thing. And even when we do see the real thing, we often don't notice it until a human artist has captured and framed it for us. The flower arrangements of Ikebana, for example, are of course already out there in nature, but now an artist has taken charge to draw them to our attention. Mount Fuji is probably known to many more people as a woodcut, in fact, than as a work of nature. So it happens that by the time we get to see the natural scene, we're already seeing it through the eyes of an earlier human artist, as indeed if it were a work of art. To continue that poem from Browning, which I quoted, he ends, we care to see, first when we love things when we see them painted, things we've passed perhaps 100 times nor cared to see. Art, he says, was given for that. God uses us to help each other so, lending our minds out. The painters drawing our attention to what's out there. He's hinting here, though, at a factor that's, I think, even more important. And this is our ubiquitous and incorrigible tendency, human tendency, to believe that phenomena of nature are not merely as if works of art, but actually genuine ones. The work, indeed, of a supremely intelligent and skilled creator. Or the belief, as the children's hymn has it, that all things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Because God made you, says another hymn, that's why I love you. And I would say it's indeed precisely the admiration for the big artist in the sky that justifies and explains the romance we have with nature, right the way through from the romantic poets to the New Age nature worshippers, to the scientists who have a love affair with natural law. So, for example, we find Newton arguing that only a supremely gifted and lovable artist could have made the laws of physics as they are. We must believe there is one God or supreme monarch. We must believe that he is the Father of whom are all things. We must believe that he is the Pantocrator, Lord of all things, with an irresistible and boundless power. Or to take a lesser case, here's the modern geneticist Francis Collins, quoted in the journal Science. When something is revealed about the human genome, I experience a feeling of awe at the realization that humanity now knows something that only God knew before. It's a deeply moving sensation. So, we love nature because we believe God made it. But I suspect it would become even closer to the psychological and biological reality to say that because God made you, because God made nature, that's why I love God. For if you think about the argument I've been making, it would seem to happen that our experience of natural beauty is going to lead to an erotic infatuation with whoever we suppose created it. If we believe that God made nature, we're going to fall in love with God, the artist. So religious ecstasy, aesthetic ecstasy, and sexual ecstasy will have become part of the same package. Look at the stars. Christ and his mother and all his hallows, it goes on. So open that gate, kiss the book of nature, live by the book of books. This Bible's Song of Solomon, supposed to have been written to celebrate Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, has been equally for Jews a celebration of the love match between Jehovah and Israel, and for Christians a celebration of the match between Christ and his church. And in the King James Version, the fourth chapter of the song is headed like this, these words. Christ setteth forth the graces of the church. He showeth his love for her. The church prayeth to be made fit for his presence. Some love, I think we might say, and some church. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shot up, a fountain sealed. Awake, O north wind, and come thou south, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. That's the poem I left the next author to take off from, and I wait to see what they're going to do with that. And that, in fact, is the end of the essay as I wrote it. But I've got some more minutes now, and I'm going to, in fact, raise another couple of issues, which I think follow on from it. And the one I want to raise first about nature worship is the relationship of nature worship to health, to relate it to yesterday's talk. Yesterday, those of you who were there, you have heard me give an account of what I called the natural health management system. I described how human beings use information from the environment to adjust how we deploy our healing resources. Take in information, make a weather forecast of a sort, and then adjust your output of defenses and immune resources and so on. And in particular, I said we pay close attention to evidence as to the kind of support we can expect. The prospects, for example, of tender, loving care. When we're safe, we can afford to let down our guard, so that, for example, the presence of a parent or a doctor will make us feel safe enough to to reduce the defensive pain which we may be feeling. And indeed, even, as I said yesterday, if that doctor is a fraud, we can nonetheless respond to the belief in the doctor, even if the doctor has no powers to help us at all. And so that's why placebo responses occur. Well, now today I've been arguing that the beauty of nature makes us feel we're in the presence of a great artist, God. And of course, we imagine this God to be also powerful and wise and caring. As Newton put it, the Father of whom are all things. So it follows that natural beauty should make us feel safe and secure too. And natural beauty should actually act as a powerful placebo. Perhaps you only have to step out into the woods or into the mountains to reduce your fever or to put your immune system back into higher gear, just as if you were being given placebo medicine. Suppose you're in pain. You go into a beautiful landscape. The landscape makes you believe, unconsciously perhaps, that you're in the presence of this great creator, Father, and God makes you feel safe, and indeed the pain goes down. But I'm not just speculating here. Of course, we know that there's lots of evidence that nature cures work. That's why sanatoriums are always traditionally out there in the mountains and the lakes, and why it's been known for so long that people respond to the beauty of nature by using their own healing resources in ways which they won't when they're confined to the city streets. Indeed, I think that nature does give to many people, even if they don't express it like that, the sense that there's someone looking after them. And that's precisely what's needed to get humans to deploy the resources they have, even to cure their cancer, but certainly to reduce their fever or to put their immune system to work at a level they wouldn't do otherwise. Now, here's another thought. Clive Bell asked, does anyone feel the same kind of emotion for a butterfly or a flower that he feels for a cathedral? But perhaps now we should put that the other way around. Perhaps, does anyone feel the same kind of emotion for a cathedral that he feels for a butterfly or a flower? Because perhaps our first experience of art was through nature and the belief in the artist who lay behind the works of nature. And it's certainly remarkable how often we build places of religious worship as imitations of natural works of art, obviously in the case of something like a Zen garden. But look at the great Gothic cathedrals and so on. I mean, of course they're imitating the structures we find out there designed by natural selection in the design of plants. Or indeed, I think in great structures like Stonehenge. I showed you an example of the Giant's Causeway made by natural forces. This gives you Stonehenge gives you the sense of its having been actually created not by people but by nature, and by nature as in sense a work of the deity. And that may be another reason why indeed Stonehenge worked, as I described yesterday, as a hospital, and why for thousands of years people came from all over Europe to camp out to cure their arthritis or their broken bones or whatever it might be. Right, so I can't resist mentioning something else, and I've got another few minutes, I think. In my talk, I said there's nothing to make love to here. But hold on, what are we seeing now? Can't you see perhaps a woman lying on her back with her thighs up there and water trickling from her vulva there? Look at this figurine, discovered from 37,000 years ago, discovered in Germany just a couple of years ago. Lay her on her birth and imagine her giving birth. Lay on her back, imagine her giving birth. And then look again at what a landscape like that can convey to us. Well, that kind of landscape, in fact, in certain parts of Europe, especially in Ireland and Scotland, I'm sure in your own country here, is in fact to be seen really quite often. And my question is, do people find these particular sites wonderful? Well, here's a surprising thing. In my first lecture on Tuesday, I drew attention to the existence of rock art depictions of what I said I believe to be depictions of the human soul. Well, I've made a survey of the rock art around the house we have in Southern Ireland. It's not a proper scientific survey, but I've been struck again and again by the coincidence of these rock art sites. They're not random in any way. No one's yet had a suggestion about why they are where they are. And again, you find them in just such a place where the mountains are, in a sense, opening up their legs and giving birth, or could be seen as giving birth to us, or to nature, to the world. I don't expect to take this as an archaeological hypothesis, but nonetheless, these are there's so much out there that we don't understand. There must be a reason why. Firstly, why they made these signs on the rocks, and I gave you a reason in the first lecture. But secondly, why they did, in fact, place them at a particular place in the landscape. And just to back up my hypothesis, I'll mention that in Ireland, it's the home of a very strange series of figures which are found carved in the rocks of churches or in town walls and so on. They're called Sheila na gigs. And these grotesque figures are, in fact, pictures of women clutching their genitals and exposing them as if to say, I'm giving birth to you and to your world. And I do suggest that actually there may be a relationship between the landscape and these figures. They aren't entirely, they also exist, I should say, in Wales and a few in England. I don't know, do you have any of these figures in Sweden that you know of? Sheila na gig? No? Okay, that's really the end of my talk for this afternoon.